She wore the same coat again, Dad. I looked it up. Goodwill. Literally Goodwill. You really need me to explain what that means? That was Shelby, Walt's daughter, 27 years old, social media manager by trade, and apparently a forensic thrift store analyst in her spare time. I was standing 6 feet from her kitchen wall when she said it. The bathroom was behind me. Her voice was in front of me. I chose the more educational option. Yeah, I was eavesdropping. I prefer the term strategic listening, but we can call it what it is. I told everyone I needed the bathroom, which was technically 3 feet to my left. Shelby's voice was 6 feet to my right. The bathroom wasn't going anywhere. The information was. But to understand how I ended up in that hallway, pressing my back against drywall and cataloging insults like a woman preparing for a deposition, I need to take you back about 7 months. I met Walt Brennan on a Saturday in March at Powell's Books on Burnside Street in Portland, Oregon. If you've never been to Powell's, it's the kind of bookstore that takes up an entire city block and smells like old paper and the quiet ambitions of people who believe they'll actually finish a 900-page biography of Theodore Roosevelt. They won't, but the smell makes them feel like they might, and that's the whole business model. I'd gone in for a specific book, Timber and Joinery, a guide to traditional woodworking techniques that my father had been reading the year he died. He'd gotten to page 212. I know because his bookmark was still there when I found it on his nightstand, a receipt from the hardware store on Hawthorne dated 6 days before his heart decided it was done. He never finished it. I wanted to buy a new copy because his had water damage from the time the roof leaked in 2019, and I'd been meaning to replace it for 3 years but kept forgetting, which is a lie. I kept not being ready. The book was on the top shelf in the orange room, which is what Powell's calls its home and garden section, because apparently every room needs a color, like a kindergarten classroom for adults. I'm 5'4". The shelf was 6'2". I was calculating whether the step stool in the corner was worth the effort and the mild humiliation when a hand reached past my right shoulder and pulled the book down. I didn't ask him to. He just saw me doing the math and decided the answer was no. He was tall. 6'1", maybe 6'2" in the boots, the kind of work boots that have actually been worked in, not the kind people buy at a department store to look like they've done something rugged. His face had that quality of a man who'd been through weather and come out the other side, with his bone structure mostly intact, gray at the temples. Hands that looked like they'd built things, and not just IKEA furniture. He handed me the book. "This is a good one," he said. "You do woodworking?" "No," I said. "My father did. He never finished reading it." He looked at me for a second, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, something more like recognition. The kind of look that says, I know what it means to hold something that belonged to someone who isn't here anymore. Then he opened the book right there, leaned against the shelf, and read a paragraph to me. Page 47. A section about dovetail joints and why they hold better than screws because the wood itself becomes the fastener. He read it the way some people read poetry, like the words had weight, and he wanted me to feel each one land. I stood there in the orange room of Powell's Books, holding my purse against my hip, listening to a man I'd known for approximately 90 seconds read to me about dovetail joints, and I thought, well, this is either the most romantic thing that's ever happened to me in a bookstore, or I'm about to be recruited into a woodworking cult. Either way, I was staying. We ended up at the coffee shop next door. 45 minutes. I know because I checked my phone when I sat down, 2:14 in the afternoon, and when I stood up with his number written on the back of a Powell's bookmark, it was 2:59. He told me his name was Walt Brennan, 54, maintenance supervisor at a community college in southeast Portland. He'd been widowed 6 years. His wife's name was June. He said her name the way you say a word. You've practiced enough that it doesn't cut anymore, but you still feel the edge. He mentioned his kids twice. Both times, something crossed his face that I couldn't quite name. A flicker. A half pause before he said, "They're good," that lasted one beat too long. I filed it. That's what I do. I file things. I have a system in my head that works like a row of cabinets, and when someone gives me a piece of information that doesn't quite fit the conversation, I don't throw it away. I slide it into a drawer and wait. At 47, my last date had been back when people still argued about whether the headphone jack should come back And that one ended when the man asked if I'd consider co-signing a 22-foot fishing boat because, and I quote, "The bank doesn't understand aquatic investments. I paid for my own appetizer and left through the side entrance of a Red Robin." So Walt was unexpected. He called the next day. Not texted, called, on the phone, like a person from an actual civilization. We talked for 50 minutes. He laughed at something I said about vendor contracts, which is a sentence that has never been true before in the history of human conversation, and when he laughed, it was the kind of laugh that made me think he wasn't performing. He was just a man on a phone, in a house, laughing because something was funny. He mentioned his kids again near the end of the call. That flicker. That pause. "They're good," he said. "They're doing well." One beat too long. I opened the drawer, I filed it again, and I waited. I should probably tell you what I actually do for a living, because it matters later in a way that will make at least one person at a dinner table choke on their pasta. I'd spent 22 years in medical device procurement by the time I met Walt. Started at 25, right after figuring out that a master's degree in biomedical engineering was a spectacular way to spend $72,000 and end up answering phones in a lab where the most exciting thing that happened on any given Tuesday was someone microwaving fish in the break room. I worked my way up. Vendor contracts, supply chain compliance, 3 company mergers, each one more soul-crushing than the last, and one regional director who called me honey until I rerouted his parking access to the gravel lot behind the loading dock where the seagulls congregated. He stopped calling me honey. He started calling me ma'am. I considered that a promotion. By 47, I was Senior Director of Procurement at Aldrich Medical Solutions in Lake Oswego, just outside Portland. I managed 11 direct reports, a vendor network worth north of $180 million annually, and a supply chain that stretched across 14 states and 2 countries. My job, in the simplest terms, was to make sure that when a hospital in Boise needed a specific titanium hip implant on a Thursday morning, it was there. Not Friday, not almost, Thursday. My salary was $44,000 a month. I had $1,050,000 in a Charles Schwab brokerage and retirement account combined. I drove a 2012 Subaru Outback with 171,000 miles and a scratch on the rear passenger door from a Trader Joe's parking lot incident 4 years ago that I kept meaning to fix but never did. Because honestly, who inspects the rear passenger door of a Subaru? Nobody. That's who. The answer is nobody. I lived in an 1,100 square foot house on Maple Lane in the Sellwood neighborhood that my parents left me. The carpet was from 2007. The kitchen had laminate countertops and an overhead light that buzzed at a frequency only dogs and 47-year-old women can hear. My mortgage was paid off. My car was paid off. My student loans had been paid off since 2014. I owned exactly one piece of jewelry worth more than $50, and it was a pair of opal earrings I bought myself after surviving my 3rd merger, and I kept them in a box in my sock drawer because I didn't trust the world enough to wear them outside. I'm telling you all of this not to brag, because there is nothing glamorous about spending 22 years in procurement. I have never once been to a gala. I have never been featured in a magazine. The most exciting email I received last year was a notification that my Costco membership had auto-renewed. But I need you to understand the distance between what I looked like and what I was, because that distance is the entire story. Now, you're probably wondering why a woman who makes $44,000 a month drives a car with a scratch she won't fix and lives in a house with carpet from the Bush administration. His name was Ryan Duvall. I met Ryan 3 months after I got promoted to director level. He was charming the way certain men are charming, the kind of charm that works like a credit card. Everything is wonderful until the bill comes. He found out my salary within 5 weeks. Not because I told him, because he opened a bank statement that arrived in the mail on a Saturday when I was in the shower. He didn't apologize, he adjusted. Suddenly, we needed a better apartment. The one I had was fine. 2 bedrooms, quiet street, good water pressure, but Ryan decided that fine wasn't enough for people like us. People like us. As if my direct deposit had made him a different person than the one who'd been splitting appetizers at Applebee's 2 months earlier. On our 2nd anniversary, he bought himself a Tag Heuer Monaco, $3,800, then told me it was for us. I didn't know watches could be a shared experience. Apparently, when a man wears one and you're allowed to look at it from across the dinner table, that counts as joint ownership. Ryan didn't love me. Ryan loved my direct deposit. He loved the version of my life that could be upgraded, expanded, optimized. He treated our relationship like a subscription service, and I was the one being auto-billed. The worst part wasn't the money. The worst part was that I let it happen because I thought that's what partnership looked like, someone who wanted to build something together. I didn't realize that what he was building was a lifestyle, and I was the foundation he planned to pour it on. I ended it 4 years ago. Sitting in the parking lot of a Charles Schwab office on Macadam Avenue, engine running, hands steady, rain on the windshield, doing that thing Portland rain does where it doesn't commit to being heavy or light. It just exists constantly. Like a background app you can't close. I sat there for 11 minutes. I know because the dashboard clock said 4:17 when I picked up the phone and 5:28 when I hung up, and the 11 minutes in between were the cost of telling a man who had memorized my account balance that he would never see it again. He didn't take it well, but I didn't take it badly, and that was what mattered. That night, sitting on my kitchen floor because the chairs felt too formal for the kind of crying I was doing, I made myself one promise. The next man who wanted me would want me without knowing what I made. He would see the Subaru with the scratch. He would see the 1,100 square foot house with the buzzing light. He would see the laminate countertops and the carpet and the woman standing in the middle of all of it, and he would either want her or he wouldn't. And if he couldn't do that, he wasn't the next man. After Ryan, I scrubbed my digital life clean, deleted LinkedIn, made Instagram private. 38 followers, one post from 2022, a photo of Mount Hood I took from my parents' back porch on a Tuesday when the light was doing something unreasonable, and I thought, that's too beautiful not to save. If someone wanted to know me, they'd have to actually know me. And then a man in a bookstore read me a paragraph about dovetail joints, and I thought, well, maybe. Our first real date was pho at a place called Luke Lock on Division Street in southeast Portland. If you've never had pho on a rainy Thursday evening in Portland, you're missing one of the few experiences in life where the weather actually improves the meal. The windows fog up, the broth steams, the rain outside makes everything inside feel like a secret you're keeping from the rest of the city. Walt ordered the large beef pho with extra basil and a Vietnamese iced coffee. I ordered the same. He looked at me like I'd passed some kind of test he didn't know he was giving, and I looked at him like a woman who had spent 4 years eating dinner alone and had forgotten what it felt like to have someone across the table who wasn't a laptop. He talked about his job, maintenance supervisor at Portland Community College Southeast Campus. He'd been there 11 years. He fixed things. Heating systems, plumbing, electrical panels, the kinds of problems that keep a building standing but nobody notices until they break. He made $51,000 a year, which he told me without flinching, without apology, the way a man tells you something true because it doesn't occur to him that it needs decoration. I told him I worked in procurement, vendor coordination, contract compliance. I kept it vague enough to be honest and boring enough to be forgettable. He nodded and asked me if I liked it. Not what do you make? Not what's your title? Not what kind of car does your company give you? Do you like it? I said most days, yeah. Some days I want to throw my laptop into the Willamette River, but most days, yeah. He laughed. I decided to keep him. By the third date, he cooked for me at his place. A 2-bedroom bungalow in the Woodstock neighborhood that he'd bought 14 years ago with his late wife, June. The house had a front porch with a swing that creaked when the wind hit it, a mailbox shaped like a trout that I suspect June had picked because it was either charming or a joke and possibly both, and a driveway where his Ford F-250 sat with a Portland Community College parking decal on the windshield that was beginning to peel at the edges. The kitchen was small. White cabinets, one handle missing on the upper right, a faucet that dripped at a rhythm I estimated was roughly every 4 seconds based on 2 minutes of observation, while Walt was looking for a colander. The drip had been going on for what I calculated was approximately 2 years, judging by the mineral stain on the porcelain, which had developed that particular shade of orange that hard water produces when it's been left to its own devices long enough to establish residency. There was a photo of June on the mantel in the living room. Candid shot. She was laughing at something off camera, wearing a green sundress, holding what looked like a glass of lemonade. Her hair was dark, pulled back loosely, and she had the kind of smile that made you feel like whatever she was laughing at must have been genuinely funny. Not polite funny, actually funny. I didn't ask about it. I didn't feel jealous. A man who keeps a photo of his dead wife in the living room is not a man who's trying to replace her. That's a man who loved someone well enough to let her stay on the mantle after she left the room. That's not a red flag. That's a resume. And then there was the piano. It sat in the corner of the living room, an upright, dark wood, the kind that looks like it belonged in a school teacher's house, which made sense because June had been one. 3rd grade. Walt mentioned it on our second date, the way people mention things that still hurt, briefly, carefully, and then he moved on. The piano lid was closed. Not just closed, but closed in the way that things are closed when someone has decided they're not opening them again anytime soon. There was a thin layer of dust on the top, and a small framed photo of June sitting at it, fingers on the keys, head tilted slightly like she was listening to something only she could hear. I wanted to ask about it. I wanted to ask if anyone played it now, or if it just sat there holding its breath the way houses do when they're waiting for a sound that isn't coming back. But some questions are doors. You only open them when you're ready for what's on the other side. And on a 3rd date, standing in a man's kitchen while he struggled with a colander that was clearly too small for the amount of spaghetti he'd made, I wasn't ready. He made spaghetti with jarred sauce. Ragu. Traditional. He didn't pretend it was homemade. He didn't apologize for it. He just cooked it the way a man cooks when he's been feeding himself for 6 years and has made peace with the jar. I ate 2 plates. I didn't say a word about the sauce because here's the thing I've learned after 22 years in procurement and 5 years with Ryan Duvall. A man who cooks for you with what he has is not the same as a man who takes you somewhere expensive with what he borrowed. The first one is feeding you. The second one is performing. I know the difference because I spent 5 years learning it, and the tuition was a Tag Heuer Monaco that I wasn't allowed to wear. Walt washed the dishes while I dried. We stood side by side at that small kitchen sink with the dripping faucet, and he told me about June without me asking. She died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Caught late, moved fast. She was 46. The same age I was when I ended things with Ryan in that Schwab parking lot, which is the kind of coincidence that doesn't mean anything but feels like it does. He said she loved that piano, played every evening after dinner. The kids would do homework at the kitchen table, and she'd play Chopin, which is a word I'm not sure I'm pronouncing correctly, but Walt said it like he'd heard it 1,000 times, and each one still sounded the same. He hasn't opened the lid since. I put the dish towel down on the counter. I looked at this man. This 54-year-old maintenance supervisor who made spaghetti with jarred sauce and washed his own dishes and kept a photo of his wife on the mantle because love doesn't stop being real just because the person does. And I thought, I could tell him everything right now. The salary, the Schwab account, the fact that I could buy this house and the one next to it and still have enough left for an aggressive index fund. But I didn't, because this wasn't about money. This was about whether the man standing next to me at this sink, with his hands in dish soap and his wife's piano sitting silent in the next room, could see me for exactly who I appeared to be and decide that was enough. And I wasn't done testing that yet. Walt came to my house on our 5th date, and I let him in the way you let someone into a room you haven't cleaned, because cleaning it would be lying about who you are. 1,100 square feet on Maple Lane in Selwood. My parents bought it in 1989 for $67,000, which at the time was considered a reasonable price for a house, and now sounds like a typo. They lived in it for 31 years. My mother died first, in the produce section of a Fred Meyer, which is a terrible place to die, but an extremely on-brand location for a woman who spent 40 years cutting coupons and arguing with cashiers about expired ones. My father followed 7 months later, in the living room, in his recliner, with a half-finished cup of coffee and that woodworking book open on his lap. I inherited the house. I inherited the carpet from 2007, which was the color of oatmeal when it was installed, and is now the color of oatmeal that has experienced regret. I inherited the kitchen with the laminate countertops that were meant to look like granite but looked like laminate pretending to be granite, which is somehow worse than just being laminate. And I inherited the overhead light that buzzes at a frequency that I'm fairly certain is being studied by the Department of Defense as a potential interrogation tool. Walt walked in. He looked around. He didn't comment on the carpet. He didn't glance at the countertops with that particular expression men get when they're calculating renovation costs in their heads. He didn't ask about square footage or property tax or whether I'd considered updating the kitchen, which is a question that real estate agents and certain boyfriends ask, when what they really mean is, this isn't good enough. He just walked in, put his jacket on the back of a kitchen chair, and said, "Nice light in here." The light was average. The comment was perfect. He noticed the empty corner in the living room where my father's bookshelf used to be. It had been a tall oak piece, 5 shelves, that my dad built himself in 1993. It gave out 2 years ago. The back panel split, the shelves sagged, and one morning I came downstairs to find 40 years' worth of paperbacks in a pile on the floor like a literary avalanche. I hauled the pieces to the curb and never replaced it because I couldn't find one that felt right, and buying a bookshelf from a box store felt like a betrayal of a man who built his own. Walt looked at the corner, looked at the wall, looked at the stack of books I'd been keeping on the floor in what I generously called a reading nook, but was actually just a pile. He didn't say anything. He walked outside to his truck, came back carrying a piece of reclaimed wood that was in the bed of the F-250, then another piece, then a toolbox. "What are you doing?" I said. He set the wood down in the corner, pulled a tape measure from his back pocket, and measured the wall, 6 feet 2 inches. He wrote it on his palm with a carpenter's pencil. "I'm going to need a few afternoons," he said. He came back the next Saturday with more wood. Reclaimed Douglas fir, he told me. Pulled it from a house demo in Milwaukee. The grain's still good. Just needs sanding. I watched him work, not the whole time because that would be strange, but enough to understand what I was seeing. He measured twice, he cut once. He sanded each shelf by hand, not with a power sander, by hand, because he said the wood tells you what it needs if you're paying attention, and a power sander doesn't listen. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. 3 Saturday afternoons, each one roughly 4 hours. I made coffee. He built. We talked in the spaces between the sawing, the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people are comfortable enough to let the silence do some of the work. On the 3rd Saturday, he finished. The bookshelf was 6 feet tall, 4 shelves, Douglas fir with a natural finish that he'd sealed with something called tung oil that smelled like the inside of a forest that had recently made a very good decision. He'd carved a small detail into the top corner of the frame, a dovetail joint, the kind that holds without screws because the wood itself becomes the fastener. Page 47. I stood there looking at it, and I understood something that I hadn't understood in 5 years with Ryan Duvall. Love is not a man who buys you something expensive with money you earned. Love is a man who drives to your house on 3 consecutive Saturdays with wood he salvaged from someone else's demolition and builds you something that wasn't there before. The bookshelf smelled like pine and patience. I put my hand on the middle shelf. The wood was smooth and warm from the sanding. Walt was standing behind me, close enough that I could smell the sawdust on his shirt. He put his hand on the shelf next to mine. Our fingers were about 2 inches apart. I turned around. He kissed me standing next to that bookshelf. In my living room with the buzzing overhead light and the oatmeal carpet and the laminate countertops, and it was the first kiss I'd had in 4 years, and it was better than anything I'd experienced in the 5 before that. Not because it was dramatic or cinematic or because violins played, because it was real. Because he tasted like coffee and sawdust, and he'd just spent 3 Saturdays building me something with his hands, and he hadn't once asked what I could afford. I could have told him everything right then, standing in that living room, still smelling the pine, still feeling the warmth of the wood under my hand. I almost did. The words were right there, stacked up behind my teeth like passengers waiting to board. Walt, I make $44,000 a month. I have $1,050,000 in a Schwab account. I could renovate this entire house and buy the one next door and still have enough left over for a diversified portfolio that would make my financial advisor weep with joy. But Walt had children. And children have opinions. And I needed to know whose opinions mattered more, theirs or his own. 2 weeks later, Walt told Shelby about me over the phone. I know the conversation happened because Walt recapped it that evening with the careful neutrality of a man trying not to start a fire. "She asked about your job," he said, pulling into the Dutch Bros drive-thru on Powell Boulevard. "I said you worked in procurement coordination." He handed me a medium iced coffee. She seemed fine with it. I took the coffee. I took a sip. I filed it. She was not fine with it. I know she was not fine with it, because 3 days later Walt mentioned, casually, the way people mention things that aren't casual at all, that Shelby had asked what kind of car I drove. There's a specific cadence to a sentence that's trying to sound like small talk, but is actually an opening move in an investigation. What kind of car does she drive is not a question about transportation. It's a question about income, priorities, self-image, and whether the woman dating your father is the kind of person who drives something respectable or the kind of person who drives a 2012 Subaru Outback with 171,000 miles and a Trader. Joe's scar on the rear passenger door. I didn't know it yet, but Shelby Brennan had already begun building a file on me that would have impressed a mid-level intelligence analyst and terrified a privacy lawyer. Here's what you need to understand about Shelby. She wasn't just nosy, she was professionally nosy. Her entire career was built on the ability to research, target, and evaluate people using publicly available information. She ran social media campaigns for a real estate agency in the Pearl District, which meant her average Tuesday involved analyzing someone's online behavior, identifying their vulnerabilities, and crafting a message designed to make them feel something specific enough to take an action. She did this with houses. She was now doing it with me. Within a week of learning my name, Shelby had assembled what I can only describe as a dossier. I know this because Walt told me piece by piece over the following weeks, each revelation delivered in that same careful weather report tone he used when he was trying to be transparent without starting a war. Zillow. She'd found my house on Zillow. 1,100 square feet. Estimated value $182,000. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, built in 1956. The listing photos were from 6 years ago when my parents' estate went through probate, which meant Shelby was looking at a picture of my mother's living room with my mother's furniture still in it and forming judgments about my character based on a dead woman's lamp choices. Instagram, 38 followers, 1 post, Mount Hood at sunset, private account. To Shelby, a private Instagram with 38 followers wasn't a sign of a person who valued privacy. It was a sign of a person who had something to hide. In her world, everyone with nothing to hide had at least 300 followers in a highlight reel. Edmonds. She'd looked up my car, 2012 Subaru Outback, estimated trade-in value somewhere between $3,800 and $4,200, depending on condition. I was confident Shelby had selected poor condition in the drop-down menu. She'd done all of this in approximately 72 hours. I know because Walt mentioned the Zillow conversation on a Tuesday, the Instagram comment on a Wednesday, and the car question had been the previous Saturday. 3 platforms, 3 days, 1 verdict. There is a particular kind of surveillance that only a 27-year-old social media manager can execute. It combines the speed of a Google search with the analytical precision of a Facebook ad algorithm, the moral flexibility of a private investigator, and the subtlety of a push notification. Shelby hadn't just looked me up, she'd audited me. She'd pulled my metadata, cross-referenced my assets, and produced a demographic profile that concluded, in summary, that I was a low-value target in a mid-tier zip code with no social proof and a depreciating vehicle. She'd formed her complete psychological profile of me before we'd ever been in the same room. I know this because Walt told me, 2 weeks later, that Shelby had mentioned something about square footage at Sunday dinner. He said it the way you report a weather event that happened somewhere else. Shelby mentioned your house is pretty small. I think she looked it up. There's a special kind of violation in knowing that a woman you've never met has studied your bathroom dimensions before she's ever shaken your hand. It's like being frisked by someone who hasn't introduced themselves. The search is thorough, the contact is unwelcome, and the person doing it believes they're entitled to whatever they find. Meanwhile, the information kept arriving. Walt didn't deliver it all at once. He parceled it out the way someone shares bad news in small doses, hoping the cumulative effect will be less devastating than the total. Shelby had asked if I owned or rented. Shelby had asked how long I'd lived there. Shelby had mentioned that houses in Selwood were holding their value, which sounds like a neutral observation, but is actually a real estate agent's way of saying, I've appraised your girlfriend and found her slightly below market. But Shelby wasn't working alone. Walt mentioned in that same careful tone that his sister-in-law had called recently, Helen Oakes, June's older sister. I'd never met her. I didn't need to. I could trace her fingerprints on every one of Shelby's comments the way you trace water damage back to the original leak. The pattern was too clean, too consistent, too practiced. Your father is replacing your mother doesn't start in a 27-year-old's head on its own. That kind of sentence gets planted by someone older, someone who has a stake in keeping the memory exactly where it is, someone who sees a new woman not as an addition but as an edit, a revision of a story they've already decided is finished. Helen meant well. That's what Walt said. Helen means well. I've learned to be cautious around people who need others to explain that they mean well. If the intention were obvious, it wouldn't need a spokesperson. 3 weeks after the car question, Walt sat across from me at a diner on Belmont Street, the one with the vinyl booths and the coffee that tastes like it was brewed during the Oregon Trail and never updated, and said, "Shelby wants to do brunch at my place. She wants to meet you." His face did that thing it does when he's trying to be hopeful but preparing for the worst, like a man checking a weather radar before a picnic he already packed for. "She wants to meet me," I said, "or she wants to confirm what she already thinks she knows." Walt blinked. "Kaylee." "Elise," I corrected, because that's my name, and I don't let people skip it even when they're being earnest. "Elise," he said, "give her a chance." I sipped my coffee. It tasted like history and regret. "I'll go," I said. And I meant it. Not because I believed Shelby would be fair, but because I needed to see what I was dealing with, face to face, in a room where the lighting was bad and the cantaloupe came from a plastic container. The first time I met Shelby and Drew Brennan in person, I wore a pair of dark jeans, a navy blue sweater I'd owned since 2019 that had reached the age where it was either vintage or evidence, and the coat. The coat deserves its own paragraph because it carries more weight than anything else I've ever put on my body, and I don't mean fabric weight, though it's also not light. It was a wool blend overcoat, charcoal gray, 3/4 length, with 2 front pockets and a small tear on the inside lining near the left cuff, that I'd repaired with a needle and thread from a hotel sewing kit I picked up at a Hampton Inn in Bend during a vendor conference in 2020. My mother bought it at the Goodwill on Milwaukee Avenue 8 months before she died. She picked it out herself from the rack near the register, held it up against me in the parking lot because the fitting rooms were closed for renovation, and said, "This looks like you, Elise, warm and a little worn in." $7. I've worn it to every event that matters since. My father's funeral, my 3rd merger survival, the day I signed the papers that made the Maple Lane house officially mine, and now a Sunday brunch at a bungalow in Woodstock where I would meet 2 people who had already decided I was a financial liability, a demographic disappointment, and a woman whose bathroom they'd studied on Zillow before learning her middle name. I wore the coat because it was mine, not because it was strategic, not because I was dressing down to make a point, not because I wanted to test anyone. I wore it because my mother picked it out, and when I put it on, I could still feel her hand on my shoulder in that Goodwill parking lot, adjusting the collar, stepping back, nodding once the way she nodded when something was right. $7. And it was right. Walt had organized the brunch at his place. Scrambled eggs, toast, that pre-sliced cantaloupe from the plastic container at Fred Meyer, and orange juice that he'd transferred from the carton into a glass pitcher, like he was hosting a diplomatic summit. I loved him a little more for the pitcher. It meant he cared. It also meant he'd washed a pitcher for the first time in probably 2 years, which I could tell because there was a faint water line near the top that suggested long-term cabinet storage. Shelby arrived 11 minutes late in a leased 2023 Mazda CX-5, which I estimated carried a monthly payment of roughly $462 based on average lease terms in the Portland metro area. That was approximately 38% of her estimated take-home pay, assuming a social media manager at a mid-size real estate agency in the Pearl District was earning somewhere between $55,000 and $62,000 before taxes and benefits. I didn't calculate this because I'm judgmental. I calculated it because I spent 22 years in procurement and my brain runs cost analyses the way other people hum songs. Involuntarily and constantly. She walked in wearing a blouse that still had the fold creases from the package, which I recognize because I work in supply chain and I know what a garment looks like when it hasn't been washed before wearing. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked casual but had clearly taken effort, which is the most expensive kind of casual there is. Drew followed her in like a footnote, 22 years old, barista at a coffee shop on Alberta Street, the kind of quiet that people mistake for depth but is usually just an absence of content. He stood up when we walked in, which was polite, and immediately sat back down, which was accurate. Brunch was an exercise in professional courtesy. Shelby smiled at me the way you smile at a dental hygienist. Necessary, brief, and designed to end the interaction as quickly as possible. She talked about her work in social media for 22 uninterrupted minutes. I know because I was sitting across from the microwave clock. She mentioned engagement rates, follower growth, client acquisition metrics, and something called a conversion funnel, which sounds like a medical device, but is apparently a marketing term for making people click on things they didn't intend to click on. She mentioned her biggest client's Instagram following, 14,000, 3 times, which, at a standard agency retainer in that market, meant she was managing an account worth roughly $4,000 a month. I didn't say this. I ate my cantaloupe. Drew's contribution to the conversation was nodding. He nodded when Shelby talked about algorithms. He nodded when she mentioned her client's follower count. He nodded when Walt asked if anyone wanted more coffee. Drew's primary function at any social gathering appeared to be confirming that previous sentences had, in fact, been spoken. A human read receipt. Then, about 40 minutes in, Drew chose to speak. His first substantive contribution to any conversation I'd witnessed. "Mom always dressed so put together," he said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his plate. But the sentence wasn't aimed at the scrambled eggs. She always said you could tell a lot about someone by how they present themselves. The sentence sat on the table like a fork someone dropped. Everyone heard it. Nobody picked it up. Walt's jaw tightened. Shelby took a sip of orange juice from the diplomatic pitcher. I cut a piece of cantaloupe into 4 precise squares because my hands needed something to do that wasn't wrapping around Drew Brennan's conversational contribution and returning it to the sender. When I excused myself to use the bathroom, I made the mistake I always make. I walked too quietly. My mother used to say I moved through a house like a cat who owed someone money, and she wasn't wrong. I heard Shelby's voice from the kitchen. Low, but not low enough. The kind of whisper designed to be heard by one person and not the other, except hallways don't take sides. "She seems nice, but Dad, think about what Mom would say." 6 words after the comma. I let them settle somewhere between my ribs, in that space where words land when they're too heavy to hold and too sharp to swallow. Think about what Mom would say. As if June Brennan's ghost had been consulted. As if the dead get a vote at brunch. I washed my hands. I dried them on a towel that had a picture of a rooster on it, because Walt was the kind of man who owned kitchen towels with roosters and didn't think twice about it, and that was another reason I loved him. I walked back to the table. I ate the rest of my cantaloupe. I smiled at Shelby. I thanked Walt for the eggs. After brunch, Shelby texted Walt. I know because he showed me, trying to be transparent, trying to prove his kids weren't as bad as they sounded. The message was 4 sentences, but only one mattered. I just want what's best for you. Mom would want that too. Mom. June. The card that never expires. The name you play when you want someone to stop talking, stop choosing, stop living in any direction that doesn't point back to the version of the family that existed before the piano lid closed. I put the phone down on the dashboard of the F-250. I looked out the window at the Woodstock neighborhood passing by, the bungalows, the old trees, the mailbox shaped like a trout. I didn't say anything. Some things you don't respond to, you just file them, close the drawer, and wait for the next one. Sometime in early June, Walt came over to fix my garbage disposal. I hadn't asked him to. I'd mentioned once during a phone call that the disposal was making a sound like a small animal trapped in an industrial blender, and that I'd been avoiding it by simply not using the left side of my sink for 3 weeks, which is the kind of adaptation that feels reasonable at the time but is objectively unhinged. He showed up the next morning with a toolbox and a flashlight. That's what Walt does. He doesn't schedule repairs. He just arrives, the way weather arrives, except useful. I was in the shower when he started. I know because I heard the garbage disposal stop making the dying animal sound at approximately 8:47 in the morning, which meant he'd fixed it in under 12 minutes, which meant it probably wasn't broken in a way that required a professional, just broken in a way that required a man who understood how things fit together and had the patience to realign them. When I came downstairs, hair still damp, he was washing his hands at the now functioning sink. His toolbox was on the counter. Next to the toolbox was my Charles Schwab quarterly statement. I know the exact moment I left it there. The previous Thursday. I'd opened it at the kitchen table while eating a bowl of cereal, scanned the numbers the way I always do, the way you check a familiar landscape to make sure the mountains are still where you left them, and then I'd set it down next to the fruit bowl because my phone rang and I forgot to put it away. $1,050,000 in print on a piece of paper, next to a banana that was 2 days past its prime. Walt didn't say anything. He didn't say anything that morning. He didn't say anything that evening when we had dinner at the Thai place on Hawthorne. He didn't say anything the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. I didn't know he'd seen it. Not then. I wouldn't know for months, not until a dinner table in a townhouse on Hawthorne Boulevard, when the information would land like a grenade tossed into a conversation that was already on fire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me stay in June for now, because June was when the second fuse got lit. My sister Margot called on a Wednesday evening. Margot is 53 years older than me, a school counselor at a middle school in Beaverton. She is kind, well-meaning, generous, and in possession of absolutely no ability to keep information to herself. Margot talks the way some people breathe. Constantly, involuntarily, and without any awareness of the temperature of the room. I love her. I also understand that telling Margot a secret is functionally equivalent to posting it on a community bulletin board in a moderately trafficked grocery store. I told her about my salary years ago, back when I got the director promotion, because she's my sister and I was proud, and I thought, reasonably, that a school counselor in Beaverton would have no occasion to share this information with anyone who could connect it back to my romantic life. I was wrong. I was wrong in the specific, devastating way that you're wrong when you assume two unrelated social circles will never overlap, which they all will, because the world is smaller than you think, and Portland is smaller than that. Margot had been at a staff luncheon. She was sitting next to Sandra Cho, a fellow counselor, and they were talking about siblings, which is a topic that sounds harmless until it isn't. Margot, 2 glasses of the school's surprisingly decent white wine into the afternoon, mentioned that her sister worked in medical procurement. Sandra asked what that meant. Margot, warmed by the wine and the flattery of someone being interested, said something along the lines of, "She does very well for herself. Actually, she's a senior director. The salary is quite something." She didn't give a number. She didn't need to. Quite something does enough work on its own. Sandra Cho, mother of Yuki Cho. Yuki Cho, who had been Shelby Brennan's best friend since freshman year at Lincoln High School. Yuki Cho, who had brunch with Shelby every other Sunday at a cafe on Alberta Street. Yuki Cho, who would hear her mother mention something interesting about a school counselor's sister who was dating a maintenance supervisor, and who would, with the inevitable gravity of information finding its natural audience, mention it to Shelby. Portland is not a large city. It feels large because of the bridges and the traffic, and the fact that it takes 45 minutes to get anywhere, but socially it operates like a small town with better coffee. Information travels through this city like rain through a gutter, slowly, thoroughly, and into every crack. I found out about Margot's disclosure on a Friday. She called me, her voice carrying that particular frequency of someone who has just realized they may have done something irreversible. "I might have said something I shouldn't have," she said. "What did you say?" I said, in the voice I use during vendor negotiations, when someone has just breached a confidentiality clause and is trying to frame it as a miscommunication. She told me. Slowly, with pauses that I recognized as the moments where she was editing the story to make it sound less bad, which meant the actual version was worse. "Margot," I said, "Sandra Cho's daughter is Shelby Brennan's best friend." Silence. 3 seconds. Then, a small, defeated "oh." "Don't say another word to anyone," I said. "Not Sandra, not your book club, not your therapist, not your cat." She promised. Margot's promises are sincere in the moment and structurally unsound over time, like a sandcastle built at high tide, but it was the best I was going to get. I hung up. I sat at my mother's kitchen table, the one with the uneven legs shimmed by a piece of cardboard from a Cheerios box that my father wedged under it in 2004 and that has held steady for over 20 years, outlasting both my parents and one garbage disposal. The math was simple. If Sandra mentioned it to Yuki, and Yuki mentioned it to Shelby, and Shelby did what Shelby does, which is research, cross-reference, and build a narrative, the whole thing would unravel. Not dramatically. Not in a confrontation, just in a quiet question over dinner some night. "Elise, Sandra Cho said something interesting about your sister." Meanwhile, Drew had called Walt the previous week asking to borrow $700 to fix his laptop. "Essential for work," he said. "Can't make coffee without tracking orders." Walt sent the money the same day because Walt is the kind of father who believes his children when they say they need something, which is a beautiful quality in a parent and a terrible quality in a banker. The laptop was not fixed, but Drew had a new stack of vinyl records and a turntable he'd found on Facebook Marketplace. His priorities were in excellent working order. Secrets have a half-life, and mine was decaying faster than I'd planned. And then my actual professional life decided to fall apart in the most tedious way possible, which, if you've ever worked in procurement, is the only way it knows how. Aldrich Medical Solutions was under audit by our largest client, Cascade Regional Health Partners, a $14.2 million annual contract that represented roughly 8% of our total vendor revenue and 100% of my ability to sleep at night. Their auditors had found pricing discrepancies in vendor contracts from 2 years before I took over the department. Someone else's mistakes, filed under someone else's name, stored in someone else's spreadsheet, now exhumed and placed on my desk with a yellow sticky note that said urgent, which in corporate language means this has been urgent for 6 weeks, but nobody wanted to deal with it, so now it's yours. $52,000. That was the discrepancy. Not my error, not my negotiation, not my signature on the purchase order, but my desk, my department. My name on the org chart directly above the words vendor strategy and procurement, which meant that when Cascade's lead auditor, a woman named Patricia Engel, whose email signature contained 5 certifications and 0 evidence of a personality, sent her findings to our executive team, it was my phone that rang at 7:14 on a Monday morning. I spent 12 nights in a row at the office past 9 in the evening. 12. I know because I kept a log, not intentionally, but because the security guard at the front desk, a man named Gerald who had worked at Aldrich longer than the building itself, started greeting me by name and leaving a fun-sized Snickers bar on the sign-out sheet, which I took as both a kindness and a commentary on my life choices. I built a 52-page response document that cross-referenced every purchase order against every contract amendment, against every vendor communication from the relevant period. I titled it internally, in my own head, Why This Is Not My Fault, a sequel, because the first volume had been the Ryan Duvall experience, and apparently my life was developing a franchise. If there is a more effective form of birth control than forensic pricing reconciliation, I have not encountered it, and I once sat through a 4-hour webinar on medical device regulatory compliance that was narrated by a man who spoke exclusively in monotone and paused after every third word as if the English language had personally offended him. I stayed awake for the entire thing. I received a certificate of completion and a $10 Starbucks gift card. I have never felt less rewarded for consciousness. The audit, the dinner invitation from Shelby, the Margot situation, the Yuki Cho pipeline, the Schwab statement sitting on my kitchen counter like a landmine disguised as mail. It was all converging on the same 2-week window, as if the universe had reviewed my calendar, identified the one period where I had no margin for error, and scheduled every possible crisis simultaneously, like a project manager from hell, with excellent organizational skills. And then there was a Tuesday night, 2:13 in the morning. I know because the microwave clock was the only light in the kitchen, and it glowed green the way microwave clocks do, with that particular shade of green that exists nowhere in nature, and only in appliances manufactured between 2003 and 2011. I was sitting at my mother's table, the one with the uneven leg, the one my father shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard from a Cheerios box in 2004. I'd tried to replace the shim once 3 years ago with the Roper wooden wedge from the hardware store, and the table wobbled worse, so I put the Cheerios cardboard back. Some fixes aren't elegant. They're just correct. I sat there in the green light with a glass of tap water and a mug that said, "World's Okayest Sister," a gift from Margot 4 Christmases ago, back when she still had a sense of humor instead of a confidentiality problem, and I let it all land on me. I was 47. Single for 4 years, hiding my income from a man I was falling in love with, being slowly exposed by my own sister's inability to stop talking at staff luncheons, being audited at work for mistakes someone else made before I arrived. and about to walk into a brunch-turned dinner where two people who had already decided I was worthless would spend 2 hours confirming it to each other, while the one person who should defend me might sit there and say nothing. Why was I doing any of this? I could end it. Walk away from Walt. Walk away from the whole situation. Go back to my quiet house with the buzzing light and the Cheerios shim table and my quiet $44,000 a month and my quiet life where the only person who judged my coat was the mirror in the bathroom with the chip in the upper left corner. I picked up my phone. I almost called Walt. My thumb hovered over his name, which I'd saved as Walt with a small icon of a bookshelf next to it because I am sentimental in ways I will never admit to anyone except, apparently, right now. Then Leah called. Leah Nguyen, Director of Regulatory Affairs at Aldrich, my closest friend at work, divorced twice, afraid of nothing, and the kind of woman who puts sriracha on scrambled eggs because regular food is, and I'm quoting her directly, a waste of my limited time on this earth. She's 46, 5'2", and has the energy of a woman who decided at some point in her 30s that she was done being polite about things that didn't deserve politeness. "Why are you awake?" I said. "Why are you awake?" she said. "I'm having a crisis." "About the audit or the boyfriend?" "Yes." She laughed. That deep, scratchy laugh that sounds like gravel being poured into a bucket, the kind of laugh that makes you feel like whatever you're going through has been survived before by someone tougher. "Elise, you're not too old for love. You're too smart for nonsense. There's a difference. Go to the dinner, eat their food, watch their faces. You'll know within the first 20 minutes whether that man is worth it. And if he's not, you drive home, pour yourself something expensive, and call me." I didn't pour anything expensive. I poured more tap water into the world's okay a sister mug and stood at the kitchen window looking at Maple Lane at 2:31 in the morning when the street was empty and the only sound was a neighbor's wind chime doing its job 3 houses down, and I thought about what Leah said. You'll know within the first 20 minutes. 20 minutes. That was all I needed. Not a lifetime, not a guarantee. Just 20 minutes in a room with bad lighting and overcooked pasta and 2 people who thought they knew what I was worth and 1 person who I needed to prove that he did. I went to bed. I slept 4 hours. In the morning, I texted Walt. "Tell Shelby I'll be there. What should I bring?" He texted back within 3 minutes, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been worrying, which meant he cared about this more than he was showing. "Just yourself." And then, because he was Walt, a second message arrived 11 seconds later. "And maybe that coat. I like that coat." I put the phone down on the nightstand. I looked at the ceiling. I pressed my hand against my chest where the words had landed, right next to the place where Shelby's whisper still lived, and I let them sit there together. The daughter who judged the coat and the father who loved it. That was the whole question, wasn't it? This has nothing to do with anything that follows, but I need to tell you about it because it's the kind of detail that explains a person better than a resume ever could. Walt Brennan makes the best mac and cheese I've ever had. Not the boxed kind, though I want to be clear that I have no objection to boxed mac and cheese and have consumed it at 11:45 at night, standing over a kitchen sink more times than I'm willing to admit in a public forum. But Walt's version exists in a different category entirely. It's the kind of mac and cheese that makes you reconsider your priorities as a human being. 4 cheeses: sharp cheddar, Gruyere, Fontina, and smoked Gouda. He grates them by hand, not with a food processor, because he says the texture matters, and the food processor makes the cheese too fine, which produces a sauce that's smooth but has no character. Walt believes cheese should have character. I have never in my life agreed with a culinary philosophy more quickly or more completely. He uses elbow macaroni because, and I'm quoting him, "Penne is for people who are trying too hard and shells trap too much air." He bakes it in a cast iron skillet with a breadcrumb topping that he makes from actual bread, not the kind that comes in a canister, and he cuts the final product into triangles. Triangles. I asked him why. He looked at me like the answer was so obvious it didn't deserve a question, which is the look Walt gives about 40% of the things I ask him, and said, "Because triangles taste better." I'm 47 years old. I'm a senior director at a medical device company. I have a retirement portfolio that could fund a small municipal project. And this man, this 54-year-old maintenance supervisor who makes $51,000 a year and drives a truck with a university parking decal, convinced me that the geometric shape of a pasta dish affects its flavor. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for evidence. I ate my triangle and I agreed with him. And I would do it again because triangles do taste better. That's not an opinion. That's engineering. The evening before the dinner at Shelby's, Walt cooked mac and cheese at his place. It was a Thursday. The kitchen smelled like Gruyere and breadcrumbs, and the particular warmth that cast iron produces when it's been in the oven for the right amount of time. Outside, it was doing that thing Portland does in September, where it can't decide whether to rain or not, so it just hangs there, gray and non-committal, like a weather system with commitment issues. We ate at his kitchen table, the small one by the window with a view of the backyard where June's garden had been. The garden was gone now, replaced by grass that Walt mowed but didn't tend, because maintaining something isn't the same as growing it, and Walt knew the difference. He'd been quiet that evening. Not the comfortable quiet that we'd developed over 7 months, the kind of quiet where two people can sit in the same room and not speak, and that's fine. This was a different quiet, the kind that has weight, the kind that presses on the air between two people and makes the silence louder than conversation. I knew he was nervous about the dinner. I knew because he'd refolded the same dish towel 3 times while the mac and cheese was baking, and because he'd mentioned Shelby's name only once, briefly, the way you mention a pending weather event that you're hoping will change course before it arrives. After dinner, we sat in the living room. His living room, the one with the bungalow walls and the mantel where June's photo still smiled at something off camera, and the piano. It sat in the corner the way it always sat, closed, quiet, holding its breath. I'd been in this room probably 20 times by then, and every time I looked at that piano. Not directly, not obviously, but the way you look at something that you know has a story you haven't been told yet, a side glance, a peripheral check, an acknowledgement that it was there and that its silence meant something. That night, I asked, "Do you ever open it?" Walt looked at the piano. His hands were wrapped around a coffee mug that said Portland Community College Staff Appreciation, Day 2021, and his thumbs pressed into the ceramic the way they do when he's thinking about something that costs him effort to say. "Not yet," he said, "but soon." I didn't ask what soon meant. I didn't ask who it was for. Some answers arrive on their own schedule, and pushing them is like pulling a plant out of the ground to check if the roots are growing. The answer is always yes, but now you've killed it. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. He put his hand on top of mine. We sat there, in the living room with June's photo and the closed piano and the smell of Gruyere still in the air, and neither of us said anything for a while. Some moments don't need words. They need contact. All right, hold on a second. I want to say something quick. If you've been listening this whole time, genuinely, from wherever you are, thank you. I mean that. And if you're new here, if someone sent you this, or it popped up on your feed and you decided to stick around, welcome, hit that subscribe button. Leave me a comment, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one, and it honestly amazes me how many different time zones show up in the same comment section. It reminds me that stories travel further than the people who tell them, and that matters. Okay, thank you. Now, back to the disaster. The day of the dinner arrived the way dental appointments arrive. Inevitably, mildly dreaded, and with the full expectation that someone would be poking at something sensitive while making small talk about the weather. Shelby had changed the plan. What had originally been pitched as a brunch had become a dinner, which is a different meal with different implications. Brunch is casual. Brunch says, "We're just getting to know each other, no pressure, here's some cantaloupe." Dinner says, "This is a formal proceeding, and the evidence will be presented after the salad course." Walt told me about the change on a Tuesday, 3 days before the dinner. "She wants to make it a real thing," he said, which was a sentence that could mean anything from "she wants to impress you" to "she's been preparing her case for a week and needs the extra time to organize her exhibits." I chose to interpret it as the latter because I'd been right about Shelby every time so far, and optimism felt like a liability I couldn't afford. "She said she's cooking something special," Walt added, with the cautious enthusiasm of a man who wanted very much to believe that something special meant food and not an ambush. I noted this the way I note a footnote in a vendor contract that seems too generous, carefully, quietly, and with the full expectation that the fine print would be unfavorable. Shelby's townhouse was a 2-bedroom unit in a complex off Hawthorne Boulevard that had been built in 2020 and still smelled faintly of drywall compound and ambition. The kind of building where every unit has the same floor plan, the same gray vinyl plank flooring, and the same belief that recessed lighting is a substitute for personality. She decorated it the way people decorate when their primary audience is a camera. White furniture, gray accent pillows arranged at angles that no human has ever naturally produced by sitting down. A gallery wall of motivational quotes in matching gold frames. One of them said she believed she could, so she did, which is a fine sentiment until you realize the woman who hung it also ran a forensic background check on her father's girlfriend's bathroom before learning her middle name. There were candles. So many candles. Bath and Body Works, based on the glass jar shape and the fact that the entire first floor smelled like mahogany teakwood, which is a scent that sounds like a law firm's waiting room and smells like a department store elevator. I counted 7 candles in the living room alone, which meant Shelby had spent roughly $63 on atmospheric fragrance for a single evening, assuming the 3-wick jars at $26.99 each, unless she'd caught a sale, in which case my estimate drops to $48, which is still more than my coat cost, and I am going to stop calculating now. On the dining table, which seated 4 and not comfortably, she'd arranged cloth napkins, a small ceramic vase with 3 fake peonies, and a breadbasket lined with a kitchen towel folded into a triangle. Presentation-wise, it was a solid B+. Execution-wise, she'd left the home goods price sticker on the bottom of the vase, $24.99. I saw it when she moved the vase to make room for the water glasses. I said nothing. Filed it. "Elise, welcome." Shelby opened the door with a smile that engaged her mouth but stopped approximately 2 millimeters short of her eyes. Professional smile. Open house smile. The kind of smile that says, I need you to like me long enough to sign something and then we can both stop pretending. Drew was on the couch. He stood up when we walked in, which was polite, and immediately sat back down, which was consistent. He was wearing a flannel shirt that looked recently purchased and jeans that looked recently ironed, which is a combination that suggests someone told him to look presentable, and he interpreted that instruction as literally as possible. "Can I get you some wine?" Shelby held up a bottle. "It's this little Pinot Noir I found." "I found" is a phrase people use when they want a $12 bottle from the end cap at Total Wine to sound like a personal discovery, like she'd hiked through a vineyard in Willamette Valley and emerged, triumphant, clutching this particular Pinot to her chest. She'd found it the same way everyone finds it. It was on sale, and the label had a nice font. "I'd love some," I said. The first 20 minutes were manageable. Shelby talked about her work in social media with the enthusiasm of a woman who believes that follower counts are a form of currency, which, in her industry, they technically are, so I'll give her that. She mentioned engagement rates, content calendars, a client whose Instagram following had grown from 8,000 to 14,000 under her management, a number she referenced 3 times in 12 minutes at a pace that would put her on track for 7 mentions by dessert. She described a campaign she'd run for a listing in the Pearl District. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, open concept, which in my experience means they removed a wall that was probably structural and now the living room echoes. She used the phrase brand synergy twice, which is not a phrase that should be used in a residential setting or possibly anywhere. Drew nodded along. Drew's function at dinner was the same as his function at brunch. Confirmation that sound waves were being produced. A human notification bell. Occasionally he made a face that might have been agreement, or might have been digestion. It was difficult to tell, and I'm not sure it mattered. Walt sat next to me, his knee touching mine under the table, which was either affection or the table was too small for 4 adults. Both, probably. He was eating slowly, the way people eat when they're monitoring the room more than the meal. Then the temperature shifted. "So, Elise." Shelby set her wineglass down. The motion was casual, but the timing was deliberate, the way a chess player moves a piece and then leans back to watch the board. "What exactly do you do in procurement?" "Like, what's your day-to-day?" I explained. "Vendor coordination, contract negotiation, supply chain compliance for medical devices." I kept it simple, not because I was hiding, but because the full explanation involved federal regulatory frameworks and distribution logistics that would sedate a room faster than general anesthesia and cost approximately the same per hour. Shelby's eyes glazed at supply chain compliance, the way most people's eyes glaze at supply chain compliance, which is immediately and completely. She nodded slowly, the careful nod of a person who has stopped listening but wants credit for appearing engaged. The same nod she probably gives clients when they ask about school districts she hasn't researched. Drew chose this moment to deliver his second meaningful sentence in the 7 months I'd known of his existence. Mom worked too, he said. He was looking at his plate again, which appeared to be his preferred conversation partner. She was a teacher, 3rd grade. Teachers actually shape lives. He paused. Procurement is what? Like ordering office supplies? The sentence landed on 3 targets in 4 seconds. Elevated June, diminished me, reduced my entire career to a supply closet inventory. Efficient, I had to give him credit for compression, if nothing else. More meaning per word than anything he'd said all year. Walt shifted in his chair. The shift was small, the kind of movement a person makes when their body disagrees with their silence. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched his hand flatten against the table. I waited. He didn't speak. And that silence, that specific silence, the kind where a man you love chooses not to speak when speaking, is exactly what is required. That hurt more than anything Shelby or Drew had said all evening. More than the Zillow search. More than the whisper at brunch. More than the word procurement spoken like it meant nothing. Because the words would have been easy. A sentence. 2 sentences. Something. Anything. She runs a department worth $180 million, or maybe just, that's not fair, Drew. But the chair didn't move, the mouth didn't open, and the silence sat between us like a third person at the table who had chosen a side. Shelby, sensing that the evening's momentum had tilted in her direction the way a courtroom shifts when the prosecution lands a point, pressed forward. I actually wanted to say something, Elise, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way. I have been alive for 47 years. I have attended hundreds of meetings, survived 3 corporate mergers, and endured a 6-year relationship with a man who once told me that buying himself a $3,800 watch was an act of love. And in all that time, across all those conversations, nobody in the history of human communication has ever followed the sentence, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, with something you shouldn't take the wrong way. That phrase is a warning label. It's the verbal equivalent of a wet floor sign placed directly over the puddle that's about to ruin your day. Dad has worked really hard, Shelby said. Her voice had shifted into a register I recognized from my years in procurement. It was the tone vendors use when they're about to renegotiate terms they already agreed to. Sympathetic on the surface, strategic underneath. He paid off the house, he's finally in a good place financially, and she glanced at Drew, who nodded like a background actor receiving his cue. We just want to make sure he's protected. Protected. From me. The woman sitting at their table eating their pasta and pretending the dinner rolls hadn't come from a bag she recognized from the freezer section at Fred Meyer because she'd bought the same brand last month and remembered the packaging. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, I said, which was a lie. I understood exactly what she meant, but I wanted to hear her say it. I wanted the words to exist in the room where Walt could hear them, where the air could hold them, where they couldn't be revised or softened or retracted later with the phrase, "That's not what I meant." Shelby picked up her phone, not reached for it casually, picked it up off the table, unlocked it with her thumb, and turned the screen toward me, the way a prosecutor presents Exhibit A. Deliberately. With purpose. With the confidence of a woman who believes that data is the same as truth. Zillow. My house. The listing photo from 6 years ago when my parents' estate went through probate. My mother's living room. My mother's lamp. My mother's curtains. Frozen in time on a real estate website, like a museum exhibit that nobody asked to see. 1,100 square feet. Estimated value, $182,000. 2 bedrooms. 1 bath. Maple Lane, Selwood. Maple Lane, right? Shelby said. She tilted her head slightly, the way people tilt their heads when they already know the answer and want you to know they know. 1,100 square feet? Drew leaned forward. His second contribution of the evening, perfectly timed, rehearsed or not, landing with the precision of a closing argument. Dad, you just paid off your house. You don't need another financial situation. Financial situation. 2 words. I let them enter my body the way a doctor lets a diagnosis settle before speaking. Not a person, not a partner. Not the woman sitting 3 feet away who had eaten their food and complimented their wine and worn a coat that cost $7 because her dead mother picked it out at a Goodwill and said it looked like her. A financial situation. A liability. A line item in their imaginary ledger of risk. A number on a screen. A square footage. A zip code. A woman reduced to the estimated value of her house the way a product is reduced to its price tag, as if everything I was could be calculated by an algorithm and found insufficient. I set my fork down. The clink of metal against ceramic was the loudest sound in the room. Louder than the candles flickering, louder than Drew's breathing, louder than the silence from the man sitting next to me, who still had not spoken. I need to stop here for a second. Because even now, telling you this part, my hands get cold, like my body remembers the moment before my brain finishes forming the sentence. The cold starts in my fingertips and works its way up to my wrists, and it's not the kind of cold you fix with a coat or a cup of coffee. It's the kind of cold that lives inside the memory itself, built into the architecture of the experience, so that every time I revisit it, my body goes back to that table before my mind catches up. Okay, I'm good. I stood up. Not dramatically. I didn't throw my napkin down. I didn't push my chair back with the kind of force that makes a sound designed to be remembered. I just stood, the way you stand when you need to leave a room before you say something that 4 people will remember 4 different ways, and you want to make sure that the version you remember is the one where you kept your dignity intact. Excuse me, I said. Bathroom. I walked down the hallway, 3 steps past the bathroom door, stopped, turned around, went in, closed the door, turned the lock. The bathroom was small. White subway tiles. A candle on the toilet tank. Eucalyptus spearmint, because apparently every room in this townhouse needed its own scent identity, like a fragrance-based zip code system. I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. The coat, the boots, the sweater. The woman who makes $44,000 a month and just got called a financial situation by a 22-year-old barista who bought vinyl records with money he borrowed from his father to fix a laptop he never fixed. The strategist in me, the part that had survived 22 years in procurement and 5 years with Ryan Duvall, and one night at 2:13 in the morning where I almost gave up on everything, that part of me ran the options like a spreadsheet. Column A, walk out. Protect yourself. End it clean. You've survived worse. You'll survive this. Drive home. Pour tap water into the world's okayest sister mug. Call Leah. Move on. Column B. Go back. Sit down. Watch. Find out if the man in the other room is the man you think he is, or if he's a passenger in his own family. Column B was riskier. Column B meant staying in a room where I'd just been appraised like a property listing with below market value. Column B meant trusting that Walt's silence was temporary, not permanent. That's not cynicism. That's 47 years of field research. I turned off the faucet I hadn't turned on. A habit. Something my hands do when my brain is busy making a decision that my hands aren't involved in. Like signing a contract you've already read 3 times, but your pen still hesitates because the ink knows something your logic doesn't. I looked at myself in the mirror one more time. The coat was still on because I hadn't taken it off when I arrived, which Shelby had noticed, and I had noticed her noticing. She'd offered to hang it up twice. I'd declined twice. Not strategically. I just don't like other people handling my coat. It's not a boundary. It's a preference. There's a difference, and the difference is that one requires an explanation and the other doesn't. Column B. I was going back. Not because I was brave. Not because I had a plan. Not because some inspirational quote on Shelby's gallery wall had moved me to action, though if she believed she could, so she did, had been the thing that tipped the scale, that would have been a level of irony I wasn't prepared to process. I was going back because I needed to see it, not hear about it later, not hope for it, not reconstruct it from Walt's careful retelling on the drive home. I needed to see with my own eyes, in real time, whether the man sitting at that table would remain a passenger in his own family or whether he'd reach for the wheel. That's not cynicism. That's procurement. You don't sign a long-term contract based on a vendor's promises. You sign it based on their performance under audit conditions. And this dinner was an audit. I opened the bathroom door. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single overhead fixture that casts the kind of light that flatters nothing and reveals everything, which is the opposite of what most people want from their hallway lighting, but was, at this particular moment, exactly what I needed. I took 3 steps toward the dining room, and then I heard it. Shelby's voice. Low, not a whisper exactly, but that frequency people use when they want to be heard by one person and not another, except walls don't have loyalties and hallways don't keep secrets. I told you she wouldn't last. Give it 10 minutes. 7 words. Directed at Drew, based on the angle of the sound. Spoken with the confidence of a woman who believed she'd already won, who had looked at the Zillow listing and the Subaru and the coat and the square footage and concluded that the sum of those numbers was a woman who would fold. Give it 10 minutes. As if my dignity had a countdown. As if walking to the bathroom was the first step toward walking out the door, and all they had to do was wait for gravity to finish the job. I stood in that hallway for 4 seconds. I know because my brain counts when the room goes quiet, the way a metronome keeps time even when the music has stopped. 4 seconds is long enough to change your mind. It's long enough to turn around, pick up your purse from the chair by the door, and leave without a scene. It's long enough to choose column A after all, to protect yourself, to survive, to drive home in the Subaru with the scratch and pour tap water into the world's okayest sister mug and call Leah and tell her she was right. 20 minutes was all you needed, and the answer was no. 4 seconds, and then I walked into the dining room. I sat down. I picked up my fork. I looked at Shelby directly, the way you look at someone when you want them to know that you heard everything, and you're choosing to stay anyway, not because you're weak, but because leaving is what they expected, and you are not in the business of meeting expectations set by people who underestimate you. The pasta is lovely, Shelby. Her face did something complicated. It started as surprise, transitioned through confusion, paused at something that might have been recalculation, and landed on a version of composure that was held together with the structural integrity of a motivational quote in a gold frame. 14 seconds of silence. I counted. Not intentionally. My brain does that when the room goes quiet and nobody is sure whose turn it is to speak. 14 seconds is longer than you think. It's long enough to pour a glass of water, change your mind about something, or watch a 27-year-old social media manager realize that the woman she'd written off as a financial situation was not, in fact, leaving. Drew looked at Shelby. Shelby looked at her wine glass. Walt looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something between surprise and recognition, the look of a man who has just watched someone do something he didn't expect but probably should have. I ate a piece of pasta. It was slightly overcooked, which I mention not to be petty, but because accuracy matters to me, and if I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to tell it right, including the texture of the rigatoni, which was approximately 2 minutes past al dente. The silence broke the way. Silence breaks when someone decides that what just happened needs to be addressed, but isn't sure how to address it without acknowledging that they've lost ground. Shelby reached for her wine, took a sip, set it down. The cycle of a person resetting. So, she said, her voice was different now. Slightly higher, slightly faster. The recalibration was audible, like a GPS rerouting after a missed turn. And then she said something that told me the evening was not over, that the Zillow listing had been the opening act, not the headline. That whatever Shelby had been preparing for tonight, the square footage and the financial situation were just the foundation, and the structure she'd been building on top of it was taller and uglier than I'd anticipated. Actually, Elise, she said, picking up her phone again with the deliberate calm of a woman reloading, I did some more research. I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt. I have been in procurement for 22 years. I have read over 4,000 vendor contracts. I have never once encountered the phrase benefit of the doubt in a document that actually extended any. The phone screen glowed in Shelby's hand, the way screens glow when they're about to deliver something that can't be taken back. Blue-white light, the color of information that hasn't decided yet whether it's a weapon or a gift. She turned the phone toward me, not toward Walt, toward me, which told me everything I needed to know about who this performance was for. It was a Facebook post, public, dated November 14th, 2019. The profile picture was small, but I recognized the face, the way you recognize a sound you haven't heard in years, but your body remembers before your brain does. Ryan Duvall. Blue polo. Smile that engaged his whole face, the same smile he wore the morning he told me the tag Heuer was for us. Shelby had found him. Of course she had. She was a social media manager. Finding people's digital footprints wasn't a hobby. It was a skill set she billed clients for. And she'd applied it to me with the thoroughness of a woman who believed that information was the same as evidence and that evidence was the same as truth. The post read, "And I am telling you this exactly as it appeared, because I memorized it the way you memorize a wound, not by choice, but because the scar tissue forms around the exact shape of the thing that cut you. My ex spent 5 years pretending to be someone she wasn't. Lesson learned. Some people collect relationships the way they collect paychecks, strategically. 47 likes, 12 comments, still live after 4 years because Ryan Duvall never deleted his victories, only his responsibilities." Shelby read it out loud. She read it the way people read things out loud, when they want the words to land harder than they would on a screen, when they want the room to hear them, when they want the air itself to carry the weight of what's being said, so that no one can later claim they didn't catch it. "This is public," she said. "Anyone can see it. I just thought Dad should know who he's really dating." The room went somewhere below silence, past quiet, past stillness, into that territory where the absence of sound has its own frequency, its own pressure, like being underwater and realizing you're deeper than you planned. My hands went cold. Not the gradual cold of a room with poor insulation, the immediate cold. The cold that starts in your fingertips and arrives fully formed, like it was waiting in the walls, and the sentence gave it permission to move in. The same cold from earlier, in the bathroom, when I heard financial situation. Except this was colder. This was older. This cold had been living in me for 4 years, stored in the same place where I kept Ryan's voice and Ryan's smile and Ryan's ability to make me feel like the worst thing about me was the best thing about him. He was reaching through a screen, through time, through a 27-year-old woman who thought she was protecting her father but was really just sharpening someone else's knife. That's what Shelby didn't understand. She thought she'd found evidence. She thought the Facebook post was proof that I was the problem, that I was the one who pretended, that I was the one who collected. She didn't know, couldn't know, that the man who wrote those words had spent 5 years treating my salary like a joint account and my love like a subscription he'd auto-enrolled in. She didn't know that strategically was the word a man uses when a woman finally stops paying for him and he needs the narrative to be her fault. But Shelby didn't care about context. Context doesn't fit on a screen. Context doesn't have likes and comments and a share button. Context requires the one thing that Shelby had never once demonstrated in 7 months of surveillance: the willingness to ask before you decide. I looked at the table, the fake peonies, the bread basket with the triangle napkin, the home goods vase with the sticker she'd forgotten to remove, the wine she'd found, the pasta that was 2 minutes past al dente, the candles burning their $63 worth of mahogany teakwood into an atmosphere designed to look like warmth but engineered to feel like a courtroom. I almost stood up. Not the controlled standing from before, the dignified exit, the column B decision. This was different. This was the kind of standing that comes from a place deeper than strategy, the animal part of you that knows when the room has become dangerous and wants to leave before the damage becomes structural. My fingers gripped the edge of the chair. My coat was still on. The door was 15 feet away. The Subaru was in the parking lot with a scratch on the rear passenger door and a full tank of gas, and no opinion about my net worth. And then Walt moved. It wasn't a large movement. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He placed his napkin on the table, slowly, deliberately, the way someone sets something down when they've made a decision they can't take back, when the internal argument is over and the verdict has been reached and the only thing left is the sentencing. The sound of the napkin touching the table was almost nothing, a whisper of fabric on wood, but I heard it the way you hear a door lock click in a quiet house. Small, final. "Are you done, Shelby?" 4 words. His voice was different. Lower. The kind of low that comes from the chest, not the throat. The kind of low that doesn't need volume because it has weight, and weight carries further than noise. Shelby's head turned toward him, her mouth open slightly. The phone was still in her hand, still showing Ryan's post, still glowing that blue-white light. "Are you done?" Shelby blinked. The phone was still in her hand, Ryan's post still glowing on the screen like a signal fire she'd lit without understanding what she was summoning. "Dad, I was just trying to show you what I—" No. One word. One syllable. But the way Walt said it, it didn't sound like one syllable. It sounded like a door closing. Not slamming. Closing. The quiet kind of close that you can't reopen by pushing harder, because the lock has already turned and the key is no longer in the room. "You're being cruel," he said, "and you've been doing it for months." Shelby's spine straightened. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out, which was the first time in 7 months I'd witnessed her run out of words. I didn't enjoy it. I'm telling you that honestly. I didn't feel victory or vindication or any of the things you might expect a woman to feel when the man she loves finally stands up in a room that's been sitting on her chest for 2 hours. What I felt was something closer to stillness. The kind of stillness that arrives when the thing you've been waiting for finally happens and your body doesn't know yet whether to exhale or hold its breath. "You looked up her house," Walt said. His voice was steady, not raised. The steadiness was what made it devastating, because volume can be dismissed as emotion, but calm can't be dismissed as anything except certainty. "You looked up her house on Zillow before you knew her middle name. You asked about her car before you asked about her job. You ran her Instagram like a background check, and when you didn't find what you were looking for, you decided the absence of information was the information. Dad, I was just being— You've brought up your mother 4 times tonight." Walt's hands were flat on the table, not clenched, not gripping. Flat, the way a person places their hands when they're grounding themselves, when they need to feel something solid underneath the words. "Not because you miss her, Shelby. Because you know it's the one thing that makes me stop talking." And it's worked. Every single time. Until right now. The room was the quietest it had been all evening, which was remarkable given that the evening had already produced several silences that could have been classified as seismic events. Drew was studying his dinner roll with the intensity of a man reading a legal document he doesn't want to be associated with. Shelby's face had gone through what I can only describe as a color cycle, pink to white to something in between that didn't have a name in any paint catalog I've ever seen. And then Walt said it. "I've known for about 3 months that Elise earns more money in a single quarter than this entire table makes in a year, combined." The air conditioning cycled off. I know because the low hum that had been running beneath the conversation since we arrived suddenly disappeared, and the room became so quiet I could hear the candle wicks hissing on the table. 7 small flames consuming $63 worth of mahogany teakwood in real time. "She didn't tell me," Walt continued. His eyes moved from Shelby to Drew and back. "I found a quarterly statement from Charles Schwab on her kitchen counter in August when I was looking for a screwdriver to fix her garbage disposal. $1,050,000 in a brokerage and retirement account. I read it, I put it back, and I never said a word." He paused. Not for dramatic effect. Walt doesn't do dramatic effect. He paused because the next sentence mattered, and he wanted it to arrive with enough space around it that no one could claim they didn't hear it, because it didn't matter to me. He looked at Shelby, then at Drew. "I wanted to see if it mattered to you." The sentence landed the way certain sentences do, not with noise, but with gravity, pulling everything in the room toward it, rearranging the furniture of the evening around a new center of weight. Shelby's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Her expression cycled through approximately 6 stages of something I'd call reckoning, though that might be generous. Shock, recalculation, panic. A brief flash of something that might have been shame if it had lasted longer than a second, then the fastest emotional pivot I've ever witnessed outside of a corporate boardroom. "Dad, I didn't. I was just looking out for you. I never meant to." "You called her a financial situation, Shelby." Walt's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 15 minutes ago, at this table, to her face. Shelby looked at Drew for support. Drew was dissecting his dinner roll into progressively smaller pieces, like a man trying to become invisible through the strategic deconstruction of bread. And then Walt turned to the Facebook post, still glowing on Shelby's phone. "And that Ryan Duvall post?" he said. "I looked him up myself, months ago. After I saw the Schwab statement, I wanted to understand why a woman who earns what Elise earns lives the way she does. So, I searched. And I found him. He pointed at the phone without touching it. That man posted about his ex-girlfriend on the internet because she stopped paying his car note. He bought himself a $3,800 watch with her money and then called her strategic when she finally cut him off. That's not evidence, Shelby. That's a confession. His, not hers. I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken. I was sitting at the table with my fork next to my plate and my coat still on and my hands no longer cold because something had happened in the last 90 seconds that I hadn't expected and my body was too busy processing it to maintain the temperature of grief. Walt had known for 3 months. He'd found the statement, looked up Ryan, put the pieces together and said nothing. Not because he was waiting for the right moment, not because he was gathering ammunition, because it genuinely did not change anything for him. And he wanted to see whether it would change anything for them. Drew, who had been silent long enough to qualify for a library card in most jurisdictions, finally spoke. What he chose in this moment of family reckoning as his contribution was quite something. But Dad, how much is a quarter exactly? Like, what's the actual... I watched Walt's face. It was the face of a man watching his son reveal the full contents of his character in 9 words. Not anger, something worse. Recognition. The kind of recognition that arrives when you realize the thing you hoped wasn't true has just confirmed itself, voluntarily, in front of witnesses. Son, Walt said, read the room. The room turned to me. Not because anyone asked, not because someone gestured or called my name or cleared their throat in that way people do when they want to redirect attention without taking responsibility for it. The room turned to me because gravity shifted, the way it does in a conversation when every other voice has spoken and the silence left behind has a shape, and the shape is the outline of the person who hasn't said anything yet. I hadn't spoken since the pasta is lovely. That was 4 minutes ago, or 5, or possibly a lifetime. Time doesn't move correctly in rooms like this. It expands and contracts, depending on who's talking and what they're saying, and whether the thing being said is something you'll carry with you for the rest of your life, or something you'll forget by the parking lot. This part I would carry. I looked at Shelby. She was sitting very still, the kind of still that people become when they realize the ground they were standing on isn't there anymore, and they don't want to move in case they fall further. Her phone was face down on the table now. Ryan's post no longer glowing. The prosecution had rested, and the verdict had come from a direction she hadn't anticipated. I looked at Drew. He was still disassembling his dinner roll. At this point, it was essentially crumbs, arranged in a pattern that might have been abstract art, or might have been a man trying to disappear into his own plate. I looked at Walt. He was looking back at me. His eyes were steady, not expectant, not asking me to perform, just present. The look of a man who had said what he needed to say, and was now making room for whatever came next. I touched the collar of my coat, the charcoal gray wool blend, the small tear on the inside lining near the left cuff that I'd repaired with a needle and thread from a Hampton Inn sewing kit. The fabric my mother's hands had adjusted in a Goodwill parking lot on Milwaukee Avenue 8 months before she died in the produce section of a Fred Meyer, which was a terrible place to die but an extremely on-brand location for a woman who spent 40 years arguing about expired coupons and winning most of the arguments. I wore this coat, I said, because my mother gave it to me before she died. My voice was steady. I didn't plan for it to be steady. I think it was steady because the words had been living inside me for so long that by the time they came out, they'd already settled into their final shape and didn't need any help. She picked it out at Goodwill, on Milwaukee Avenue. It cost $7. She held it up to me in the parking lot because the fitting rooms were closed, and she said, "This looks like you, Elise. Warm and a little worn in." I paused, not for effect, because my throat did something it doesn't usually do, a tightening that felt like the words were wider than the space available, and I needed a second for them to fit through. "It's worth more to me than anything in this room." Nobody said anything. The candles kept burning. The mahogany teakwood kept dissipating into air that no longer smelled like a law firm's waiting room, but like the inside of a moment that would change the shape of this family regardless of what happened next. Sometimes the smallest price tag in the room is the one that ends the conversation. Walt stood. He walked to the hall closet, the one near the front door, and took my coat off the hanger where Shelby had placed it after I finally let her take it when we sat down for dinner. He held it open for me. Both hands, arms extended, the way a man holds a coat when he isn't just helping you put it on, but telling the room, and everyone in it, that the two of you are leaving and the decision isn't up for discussion. I stood up. I put my arms through the sleeves. The lining was cool against my wrists, the way wool gets when it's been hanging in a closet for 2 hours in a room kept at 68 degrees by someone who is very particular about their thermostat. "We're leaving," Walt said. Shelby's chair scraped against the vinyl plank floor. The sound was sharp, accidental, the kind of sound furniture makes when the person sitting in it moves too quickly because the situation has moved too quickly and their body is trying to catch up. Dad, you can't just..." The door closed behind us. October air. The parking lot. My face registered the temperature before the dashboard confirmed it. 46 degrees. The kind of cold that doesn't hurt but reminds you that you're outside, that you've left somewhere, that the thing behind you is behind you now. Walt started the engine. The F-250's heater clicked on. Tom Petty was still in the CD player from the drive over, paused mid-song, waiting where we'd left him like a friend who didn't mind being put on hold. Neither of us touched the stereo. Some silences have their own soundtrack, and it isn't music. It's the hum of an engine, and the sound of two people breathing in the same small space, and the particular quiet that exists between a moment that just ended and whatever comes next. "I'm sorry, Elise." His voice cracked on the second word, just barely. A fracture you'd miss if you weren't listening for it, the way a hairline crack in porcelain is invisible until the light catches it at exactly the right angle. I should have said something the first time. At the brunch. When Drew said that thing about your job. When Shelby whispered. I heard it all, and I sat there. And I didn't. I put my hand on his arm. The same arm I'd held on a Thursday night in his living room with a closed piano and the smell of Gruyere. "You said it when it mattered," I said. He looked at me. This man. This 54-year-old maintenance supervisor who made $51,000 a year and drove a truck with a peeling parking decal and cut mac and cheese into triangles because he believed in geometry and had known my secret for 3 months and never mentioned it. Not because he was afraid, not because he was waiting for leverage, because it didn't change anything for him. He drove. I watched the streetlights pass over the dashboard, amber on gray, the rhythm of a city at night that doesn't know what just happened in one of its townhouses and wouldn't care if it did. Somewhere behind us, in an apartment that smelled like mahogany teakwood and regret, Shelby Brennan was learning that a $7 coat had just cost her a father. We pulled into Walt's driveway. The bungalow was dark, except for the porch light, which he'd left on, the way people leave porch lights on when they're planning to come home, when they believe there's still something worth returning to. He turned off the engine, sat for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not sadness, not relief. Something that lived between the two, in the territory where endings and beginnings share a border. "I have something to show you," he said. He led me through the side door of the bungalow, past the kitchen where the faucet still dripped every 4 seconds, past the living room where June's photo smiled at something off camera, and into the garage. He reached for the light switch. The fluorescent tube flickered twice, the way old fluorescents do when they're deciding whether to cooperate, and then the room filled with that flat, honest light that hides nothing. The piano was in the center of the garage. June's piano. The upright with the dark wood that had been sitting in the corner of the living room with its lid closed for 6 years, except it wasn't the same piano anymore. The wood had been stripped, sanded, and refinished until it caught the light like glass. The keys had been cleaned, some replaced. The brass pedals were polished. The bench had been reupholstered in something dark and simple, the kind of fabric a man chooses when he doesn't know fabric but knows what feels right. He'd been doing this for months. Evenings. Weekends, hours. I thought he was running errands. He'd been restoring his dead wife's piano the way he restored everything. Carefully, slowly, with his hands. There was a note on the music stand, a small piece of paper torn from a yellow legal pad, with handwriting I recognized from a Powell's bookmark 7 months ago. "For the girl who stopped playing, it's time to start again. Walt." I'd mentioned it once, maybe twice, that I'd played piano as a child. Lessons at 8, kept going until 17, when my father got sick and the money went somewhere else. By the time it came back, my hands had forgotten and I was too embarrassed to start over. He'd taken that half-finished sentence from a conversation I barely recalled and built this. I sat on the bench. The keys were cool under my fingers. I played something slow I'd learned at 14, a simplified arrangement my teacher gave me because the real version was too advanced. "Start here," she'd said. "You'll get to the rest later." I never got to the rest. But the start was still there, buried under 30 years of silence. The notes filled the garage. Imperfect, wrong keys, a hesitation where my left hand couldn't remember what my right hand was doing, but sound, real sound, the kind that vibrates in your chest and reminds you that some things don't disappear just because you stop doing them. They wait. Walt stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed. He didn't say anything. He just listened, the way he'd listened to that piano's silence for 6 years, and now he was listening to its opposite, and both sounded like something he'd been waiting for. I played until my fingers hurt, then I stopped, and I cried. Not loudly, the quiet kind that happens when something you thought was lost comes back, and the relief doesn't fit anywhere except out. Walt sat next to me on the bench. He put his arm around my shoulders. We sat there, 2 people on a piano bench in a garage, and that was enough. Shelby called Walt every day for 3 weeks. He didn't answer. "I'm not punishing her," he told me on the 4th day, sitting on my porch with coffee he'd forgotten to drink. "I just don't know what to say yet, and I'm not going to talk until I do." Drew sent one text. 5 words. "Dad, can we talk?" Walt replied, "When you're ready to apologize to Elise, not to me." Drew didn't respond. 5 words was apparently his quarterly output. Shelby found my Instagram and sent a DM. 3 paragraphs. The kind of apology that's really an explanation, which is really a justification, which is really a request to be forgiven without changing anything. "I'm sorry if I came across as if." If. The load-bearing word in every false apology. I didn't respond. Helen called on a Thursday. The kids are devastated. Walt's response was the only part of this story I asked him to repeat. "They're not kids, Helen. They're 27 and 22. And they're not devastated. They're embarrassed. Those are different things." June would have asked Elise about her favorite book, not her house. She would have made her feel welcome, not measured. Thanksgiving came. Walt and I cooked in his kitchen, the one with the missing cabinet handle and the dripping faucet. He made mac and cheese, 4 cheeses, triangles. I made a small turkey, because 2 people don't need a 20-pound bird. We ate at his table. We didn't say grace in the traditional sense. But Walt said, "I'm grateful," and I said, "Me too," and that was its own kind of prayer. Sometimes God doesn't need a formal invitation. Sometimes he's already at the table, sitting in the silence between 2 people who found each other late and loved each other well. I called Margot the Monday after. "I'll help with the scholarship fund. But I need a real proposal. Numbers, timeline, criteria, not a napkin sketch." She sent an 8-page Google Doc. The margins were wrong. She'd spelled fiduciary 3 different ways. But it was a plan. Grace isn't about getting it right. It's about getting started. I still wear the coat. $7. Goodwill on Milwaukee Avenue. My mother's hands adjusting the collar in the parking lot, warm and a little worn in. The most valuable thing you can wear isn't something anyone can price. It's not a watch bought with your money. It's not a leased car or a gallery wall of quotes or a vase with a sticker you forgot to peel off. The most valuable thing is whether the people around you would treat you the same if you had nothing. That's the real price tag, and it never goes on sale. God puts people in your life at the exact moment you need them, even when it looks like a man reaching for a book on a shelf you can't reach. And sometimes he takes things away, not to punish you, but to make room for what's coming. The coat my mother picked for $7 has carried me further than anything I've ever owned, and the man who loved me while I wore it carried me the rest of the way. Thank you for being here, for staying through the hallway and the bookstore and the piano. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Because the next story on your screen, let's just say the table gets flipped a little harder. Click it, you won't want to miss it.